Today, we're a pretty interesting agenda, as at many other fora. We're going to talk about raising private investment into municipal transport, not the other way around. I would say that this agenda is becoming increasingly more interesting, and the trend is, well, regarding development of the new types of municipal transport, while Moscow implements most of the projects at the expense of the public budget. Today we have Russian speakers and foreign speakers from different spheres, from consulting, public governance, private business. I would like our discussion to be, let's say, on an equal footing. I would suggest that all one will think about the same questions, the same issues. First and foremost, if a city has, well, a pretty good balance, like Moscow, do they need private investment? They may be more expensive. Why we need private investment then? The second question is that what segments of municipal transport are undervalued now in terms of raising let's say, private investment. That is, areas where we can raise more private investment than we do now. And the final question, let's just give at your discretion an example of two main conditions which are prerequisite for raising investment in the municipal transport area. Thanks to all speakers. I'm giving the floor to Deputy Director of the Municipal Agency of Managing Investment, Artem Baryshev. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, Pavel. Indeed, investment in the public or municipal transport or in transport infrastructure in general in Moscow is a very critical one, because notwithstanding the fact that plenty of money is spent in the city on development of the municipal transportation infrastructure, nevertheless, some people may be surprised that in the portfolio of public-private partnership with the city, transport accounts for the lion's share of that portfolio, that the bulk of private investment goes into this area. Moscow uses a non-conventional for Russia for raising private investment. In some cases, this may be called as direct investment with pretty standard methods of payback and recovery. In some cases, it may be described as quasi-public-private partnership or quasi-private investment. I will give some examples. To start with some general figures, the city of Moscow has a target investment program to the tune of more than 1.5 trillion rubles for the next 3 years. These are funds which are channeled to develop infrastructure in general. And as I said, the bulk of this amount is used to develop transportation. It includes both municipal transport, motorways, etc. And in the city, we implement a variety of large-scale investment projects, which, among other things, are implemented with the involvement of private businesses. The more known of them are that's the program of development of Moscow Metro. Just for reference, is the second largest program in the world. The biggest one is in China. We procure a variety of plenty of rolling stock, because the Moscow metro infrastructure was created quite a long time ago, and it was not, let's say, renewed since the 90s. And in the recent years, we see a lot of renewals. This 1.5 trillion rubles amount includes some of the projects which are already underway, some of the future projects of creation. The so-called Moscow Central Diameter is a new type of municipal transport which will link the outskirts of the city with the downtown area and with other outskirts. As I said, the city of Moscow for maybe 3 or 4 years in a row, my colleagues will confirm that, ranks #1 in terms of development of private-public partnership in the city, largely thanks to the fact that the city implements these private-public partnership projects in the transportation area. Well, about 875 billion worth of projects, over 70% account for transport. That's motor roads, municipal transport, and public infrastructure. As for motorways, we implement the first one, toll road in the city, and it is built exclusively on account of private investment. The investment runs to the tune of 40 billion rubles. The design stage is over. The land plot has already been allocated. Investors are preparing that territory for construction, and in September construction will start. By late 21 it will be commissioned. This is the road from Moscow city. That's the most important business center in this country, and it will go to the outskirts of Moscow, and it will be linked to the toll road around the city of Odintsovo. The concession term is 40 years. It's a pretty standard, pretty conventional tool for raising investment in this country. Concession with direct charging for the use of this mechanism. But there are other mechanisms as well. The largest of them is the life cycle contracts for municipal transport. Here we started with buying a rolling stock for our metro, and then it was deployed for other types of municipal transport. Why we describe this project as a project with private investment, although effectively we spent money to, let's say, renew our municipal transport fleet. It's quite simple. An investor first creates and delivers to the city some amount of rolling stock, like, let's say, streetcars, buses, etc., at his or her own account, and then receives payment or toll payments for maintaining this rolling stock workable. What are the advantages of this approach? The city pays not for the fact of delivery of rolling stock or buses. The city pays for the fact that this rolling stock, these buses, well, in sound condition, are used on a daily basis in the city. If it is not the case, then the city doesn't pay anything. The advantage for any investor is that it is a long-term contract. Well, for the metro, the life cycle is 30 years. An investor or supplier receives, well, a significant amount of procurement, and then the supplier provides a workload for his production maintenance base for 30 years. So that's the advantage. This is a classical win-win situation, and well, again, all parties stand to benefit from that. The same approach is used to other types of transportation like buses, streetcars, and electric buses. The system proved efficient, and we want to deploy it not only to the transport industry but to other spheres. We contemplate starting similar contracts for procurement of medical equipment. Well, now these expensive items are bought at the cost of the city budget. Our city is innovator in Russia in terms of procurement and operation of buses. By this time, the city procured 300 units. These are already operated in Moscow. On the one hand, it's a testing period for these vehicles. On the other hand, we clearly understand that we are working for the future, because on top of the fact that the city improves the environmental situation and cuts its maintenance costs, and electric buses are less costly in the long term, we also develop the production base, because suppliers of this equipment that are domestic suppliers, and all production is localized in this country. In the next 2 years, we plan to procure 300 units of electric buses per annum, and our mayor announced today that the city will encourage localization of production of these buses directly in the city. We are going to continue this story. There is another tool to raise private investment in the transportation infrastructure. We have a large-scale program of development of transit nodes. This is a facility which allows to use multimodal transportation, lots like Moscow Metro, then the City Railroad, and going forward, it will be linked to the central diameter, which I talked about before. What is the underlying idea of this project and of these tools that we used at these transit nodes? We invite investors to build these transit centers, meaning that the investor, at his or her expense, will create the infrastructure side, but the city doesn't pay anything. The transportation infrastructure will be paid back by the commercial infrastructure which surrounds the transportation infrastructure. That may be retail space, office space, hotel space, etc. The program is estimated at 1 trillion rubles of private investment. It embraces over 250 nodes. 17 of them are under construction already. And for these 17 transit nodes, the expected amount of investment exceeds 120 billion rubles. It translates into more than $2 billion US. On top of that, in Moscow, we contemplate new types of transport. Quite recently, we look and we seriously consider implementation of a network. It's aerial roads. The payback will be achieved using commercial operation of these facilities, of this elevated road means. It's close to the node that we discussed before. We also look at the possibility of we look at the creation of 10 more cable lifts. It's difficult to predict which of them will be implemented. We talk to investors, we talk to manufacturers of cable lifts. and probably shortly we're going to announce more specific plans. We have one cable lift operating already. It proved its efficiency. And we see an active interest towards the second cable lift, where the tender has been announced already. And going forward, cable lifts can transport up to 25,000 people, connecting, well, some remote territories in the city where people face natural barriers like a river or a park on the way, or maybe some busy motorways. Well, this is the environment that we have now. I briefly discussed, in a nutshell, how we raise private investment for transport infrastructure. We are eager to discuss any new tools for investment, and our department has been created for this purpose. Exactly. Well, any colleagues who have any proposal are invited. Well, you may reach us even through our web portal. Thank you, Artem.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your brilliant presentation, and thank you for keeping up with the timing. So, if you have any questions, you're welcome. If anyone has any questions, please. Artem, you just called some of the most famous cable lift projects, but what could you connect with the cable lift? Like, what areas, which districts? Do you have any examples? I was restrained from calling all the projects of using cable lifts, but probably the most probable projects are connecting the so-called Dream Island and connecting it with the metro station. Besides, the big circle metro line might be connected with the Khrushchev Space Center. These are some of the probable projects, but maybe there will be more. Well, I also have another question. When you talk about the life cycle project, you had two. You had two-step project. What would be the main criteria? What would be the tender for this project? Unfortunately, we don't have many criteria, such various criteria for picking up the winner of the tender. So the price was one of the key factors. But of course, we conducted a thorough feasibility study in order to have a very good competence before announcing the tender. So when we received the tender, when we had the tender applications, we already knew well enough what this technology, what this kind of technology is, and what this project is about. Now let me pass the floor to Robert Puentes, who just came from the United States and who is the Vice President for Transport for Consultation. This is so this is a non-commercial company. And, can you please tell me briefly what your company is engaged in? So the floor is yours.
For the introduction, and thank you for having me. This has been a wonderful conference so far. Just a quick advertisement. The ENO Center for Transportation is a 100-year-old public policy think tank. We're based in Washington, D.C. A think tank in this case, we do research and policy analysis. We are completely independent, which is a rare thing in Washington, D.C. these days. We are also a nonprofit, so we generate revenue through donations and philanthropic organizations, things like that. As far as I can tell, we're the only transportation think tank in the world, certainly in the United States, that focuses on all modes of transportation, everything from aviation down to electric scooters and everything in between. We are based in Washington, D.C., so we do work with the federal government, but most of the work is done in cities and states and metropolitan areas all across the country because Washington is not a high-functioning place right now on the federal level, and all of the interesting things are happening in the states and the cities in the United States. And this conversation that we've been having, I think, is very relevant to the conversation that we're having in the United States around transportation and how to pay for things. Folks may recognize that the President of the United States a few years ago, about 2 or 3 years ago, announced a $2 trillion infrastructure package. So I think over 100 trillion Russian rubles. Match that with some colleagues in the United States Senate. So big, ambitious plans to build a lot of infrastructure, most of that in transportation, but really no plans for how to pay for it. And so the default proposition, the next plan has been to, well, let's see if the private sector will contribute to these projects. And I'm here to say this is the wrong way to go around trying to find those kind of investments. To the question that was asked, if there is resources on the public side, it's probably not the best idea to go to a private investor because it's always going to be more expensive, particularly in the United States. That said, there are lots and lots of really good reasons why a country like the United States would work with private companies. But it's not for doing things cheaper. It's for getting better projects. It's for getting projects done faster. It's for a better sharing of risks and rewards between the public and the private side. But if it's being done as a way to avoid public investment that they would normally have to make, if it's a way to avoid paying taxes or to generate or raising taxes to pay for new infrastructure, or it's a way of doing things kind of off budget that's not being calculated, then it's probably the wrong way to go, especially in the United States. The other problem is that, especially in transport, and especially in the United States, all these different sectors of infrastructure are designed and governed and financed and delivered very, very differently. The public sector has a very strong role to play in certain areas of transportation infrastructure, like public transit, mass transit, highways, airports, things like that. But at least in the United States, our freight rail system is entirely privately owned, so there really isn't a public role there. So we have to be much clearer, at least in our country, about what specific investments we're talking about, and that'll help us understand what the public or the private sector role is in those investments. So just 3 things to connect this conversation related to trends that are happening in the United States. The first thing is that, and I think I've heard today, we've got to move away from this kind of simplistic notion of just public-private partnerships with the public sector as being transactional. That there is a specific project, and we're trying to generate money, or we're trying to lease it, and that there is a transaction to be had, and once we do that transaction, then the engagement is over. What's happening in the United States now, which is very interesting, is that the public and the private sector and the nonprofit sector are working together to do real problem solving. So recognizing that there's a wealth of expertise happening on the private side, there may be money to invest, but there's also expertise and innovation that they're bringing to the table. So Los Angeles is a great example of a major global city that has enormous ambitions for building out their transportation infrastructure. They recognize that they don't have all the resources to do it. They have an awful lot because they've been able to raise some money. But they've opened up their doors. The county has opened up the doors and said, if you have ideas on the private side to help us deal with traffic congestion or accessibility issues or greenhouse gas problems, please come to us, and we're very interested in working on a deal with you. And so those new ideas are coming through and circulating throughout the county, throughout these public agencies, injecting new ideas, new light, new vitality to those conversations. It's very interesting what's happening there. And now other cities in the United States, which we always do, are trying to steal those ideas and to implement them elsewhere. Stealing ideas is fine in this case. The second thing is that it's important to understand, I think, the motivations between the public and the private sector. Again, with the example I said at the beginning, working with the private sector is not going to be just the next best option. It's not going to be something you're going to be able to get the private sector to do to meet a bunch of public policy goals. The private sector is in the business to make money, at least in the United States. That's what they're trying to accomplish. And if they're not going to be able to make money in a clear, direct way or to grow the markets or any other kind of business expense, they're not interested in the project. Now, that might sound intuitive and simplistic, but you'd be surprised at how many places are trying to get the private sector to do things that the public sector should be doing, trying to meet different policy goals, particularly social goals around things like accessibility. The private sector understands it, they care about it, but it's not really going to be anything that they're going to negotiate on. So the motivations for the private sector are very clear. The challenges are the motivations on the public sector are usually either unknown or they vacillate and they waver. And when a new political leader comes in, those motivations may change. So in order to get deals done, in order to really do that kind of problem solving I talked about, there has to be that kind of alignment between the public and the private sector goals. The third thing then is, and I say a good example of that is happening in the Washington, D.C. region, not federal Washington, but in the city there, where the state of Virginia knew that they wanted to expand a particular roadway so that they could fix the bridges, they could invest in public transit, they could invest in biking and walking, and so they put it out to bid, and they said if the private sector can come and do it cheaper, that's great. If not, we'll do it ourselves. Somebody came in, they wanted to enter the market, they did it cheaper. That's a win-win. That happened in that region as well. The third thing then is around capacity. Because we don't have a whole lot of experience with these projects in the United States, there's a big disconnect between the expertise that's happening from these global private firms, investors, consultants, and others, and the public sector, which are basically very hardworking, dedicated bureaucrats, but do not have the same kind of expertise, financial expertise, or transactional or procurement expertise to get these deals done. And so what happens is not that bad projects get built, but nothing gets done. So there's a lot of frustration on both sides. If you're going to invest with the private sector, if you're going to bring them to the table, you have to have that expertise to match them so you actually could have these conversations around these different transactions. So to your three questions, I think the first thing is if there are public sector resources, there are certainly reasons to invest or to engage with the private sector. It's not always going to be just to bring money to the table. It's around expertise and risk sharing and things like that. The second thing around areas that are underinvested, what we're trying to do and what we see happening around the world, particularly in places like Japan, is this tighter connection between the transport investments and the land use and the real estate that's connected there. So Tokyo Station, obviously famously very, very busy and very lucrative, is a real estate deal, and the private sector company owns both the rail coming into it as well as the buildings that it's on. So they recognize the connection between transportation and land use, and they make an awful lot of money from that investment. And then the third thing, things that you should do to kind of stimulate more private investment. One, I think, as I said, is already around expertise and capacity. There has to be that alignment between the public and the private side so deals can get done. And at least in the United States, there has to be laws and legislation that allow these deals to happen in the first place. So I want to thank you very much for having me here. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Robert. So, can I ask you a question? When you say Los Angeles opened doors for private initiatives, what practically happens? How it works?
So they have a new general manager for the Los Angeles County Metro, a major transportation agency in that region. He came in and he created something called the Office of Extraordinary Innovation. And he called it that on purpose to have it to be a big kind of announcement that this is going to be something we're going to do things differently. We're going to shift away from the slow, bureaucratic, plodding way that this agency has worked before, and we're going to bring in the speed, the efficiency, the innovation that the private sector has. He recognized at the same time that they have a lot of constraints for doing things. They have procurement rules and transparency rules and things like that they have to keep in mind. But they created this office, and the office then set out basically a request for proposals to bring in ideas. They have a very formal process then for vetting those ideas, for evaluating them. Doesn't mean they're going to have to do them all. In fact, they don't have to do any of them if they don't think that there is something that's valuable. But it's already resulted in lots of new ideas because this transformation that's happening in transportation is being led by the private sector, at least in the United States, and those ideas are being filtered through the agency. It's very exciting.
Есть ли еще вопросы? Очень рекомендую что-нибудь спросить.
Hi, actually, Hi, actually, I wanted to follow up on that question. Can you speak to some of the examples in Los Angeles infrastructure that have moved significantly because of this? I'm wondering how much of that also plays into the fact that the Olympics are coming up, and there's this outside want for speeding up some of these projects.
Yeah, they're two separate issues, I think, but you're absolutely right about the second one. The Olympics are coming to Los Angeles, and the mayor has decided he wants to accelerate a whole bunch of these projects in advance of the Olympics because of the big global stage. It's a little bit different from the private piece of it, even though there are some of those investments that they want to consider as a P3. There were a couple of tunnels. They're going to blow through some mountains and some traffic congestion relief, things they're trying to do. So the bigger projects are kind of living in that sphere, and they're going to get some of those done. The innovations from this Office of Extraordinary Innovation are kind of ways to do things better internally. It's a lot of data sharing. It's a lot of micro-mobility things. So it's kind of more operational and behind the scenes, but they're mostly private companies, from my understanding, that are trying to break in and trying to make a name for themselves. They have a better way to collect data. They have a better way to report things. They have a better way to do this. So it's not visible, high-profile projects necessarily as it is ways for them to engage better across the board.
Еще вопросы, пожалуйста. Да, может быть, кто-нибудь хочет не согласиться со спикером.
Can we completely move away from the public transit to private transportation, for instance, in the US?
Certainly not. And certainly not in the United States. The challenge that we have is our public transit, our mass transit systems are chronically underinvested in right now. We're losing ridership. There's reliability problems. You know, the New York subway system, for example, the biggest one that we have by far, is experiencing tremendous problems. There is no private investor who's going to come to the rescue and save these agencies. None, not one. There are some cities, though, who are thinking to themselves, well, we invest a lot in our public transit system now, but we have Lyft and we have Uber and we have these new mobility options. Maybe they can take the place of public transit in our city. And so that conversation is happening. I don't think it's the wise move because we're going to need public transit for lots of different reasons, particularly for vulnerable populations. But that is the churning that's happening right now in the United States is that tension between the new investments that are coming from the private sector and the challenges we're experiencing with traditional public infrastructure like mass transit. But I can't see any place where it's going to be able to replace it, certainly not in the biggest metro areas.
Еще вопросы? Может быть,
Any more questions?
maybe. What do you think when the infrastructure or rolling stock are privately owned? Sometimes they don't have the private partner, doesn't have the motivation to renew the infrastructure or the rolling stock. And sometimes in the United States, well, it's also happened, we can see very old trams, very old infrastructure, tunnels, etc. What do you think, how we can pursue to do this, to renew?
Sure, I think the best part of these public and private sector partnerships is that you can incorporate those kind of policy goals into the contracts. If, famously, as you said, the public sector hasn't been able to upgrade and maintain the system because of political reasons or whatever, you can actually engage with a private partner and then lock that in for 50 years, 99 years, whatever it is, that the infrastructure, the rolling stock, whatever it is, will be held to a certain condition. And if not, then they're in violation of the contract, and then that's something you can litigate on. So the promise is that if you incorporate those, then those problems actually get better if you engage in these partnerships. But it has to be put into the contract, it has to be done up front, and it has to be agreed upon.
Standards. Yes. Спасибо большое. Я хотел бы передать...
Thank you very much. I am passing the floor to Jeffrey Seider, who is Vice President of Advisory Service WSP. This is a private company consulting, one of the largest in the world, from Canada. They provide consulting in construction, infrastructure, and environment.
Do we have a clicker? Thanks. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this dialogue. I'd like to say from the outset, I agree with everything that the previous speaker just spoke about. Public-private partnerships are not necessarily the panacea and the answer to all projects. Canada has got a fairly long history with public-private partnerships, has got a very well-defined policy and structure for P3s. In fact, currently Canada is the world leader in the investment in P3s as a percentage of GDP. So I caution you with the statistics, but by comparison, the United States is spending 0.5% on infrastructure, and India is about the same. Canada, by comparison, is spending 14% of GDP on infrastructure. All of that said, Canada's GDP is about 1/10 of the United States. So, put it into perspective. A few other things. You spoke about the output specifications. Typically, to ensure that the private partner actually acts appropriately, we do put in very significant and detailed output specifications that have consequences for them not meeting it. Nowadays, when I started out in this business, rather, we did P3s that had a 100-year life. Most of in 20 or 30 years ago, we were looking at 100-year lives. Nowadays, it is standard for a public-private partnership. Its standard term is around about 30 years. That also gives ensures that the private party has sufficient time to get a return, that they keep them honest, and as well on top of that, we typically like to see a financing part of that because there's a design, build, finance, maintain, and operate. And the reason you have financing there is you have another agency, namely the banks, who want to see that, who stand over the developer to see that they actually perform. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot. We at WSP, I head up the advisory group of WSP, and we're a global company. We do work around the world. We work in 45 countries, and currently have somewhere in the region of $20 or $30 billion worth of infrastructure that we're involved in, or rather my group is involved in around the world, from the highways in Dhaka, Bangladesh, through to infrastructure in and around North America. We've been involved in a little over 100 public-private partnerships, infrastructure projects with a capital value of well over $100 billion. Just a little bit about Moscow. We work very closely with the city of Moscow. We've been working with the Mostrans project on assisting them with the optimization of the new electric bus fleet, and very closely with the Institute of Moscow General Plan under the direction of Deputy Mayor Murat Hisnullin. I say that because I'll come back to some of my concerns on that. Basically, Moscow has this very highly developed and integrated transit system. It's a pleasure to ride on. It's a pleasure to experience, and the pace of development that's going on in Moscow is quite spectacular, and obviously a good platform for public-private partnerships. Our concern, though, is while Moscow is vying for these public-private partnerships, they're competing with the rest of the world and competing for limited dollars. And if you have a look at what's on the screen now, is the former Soviet Union is somewhere in the middle in terms of the amount of transportation systems and growth in transportation systems. So it's competing against many other jurisdictions with different risk profiles. And one of the things that we have to understand, as you pointed out earlier, private entities are there to make money. They're there to provide profit to their shareholders and increase shareholder wealth. That's why they're in business. And so in attracting these companies, we need to be very careful that we meet their needs. Three basic needs. There's a rigorous pre-development planning and analysis, concept designs, an appropriate environmental impact assessments, land ownership is fully defined, and realistic forecasts. There needs to be a fair, thorough, and transparent procurement, and there needs to be an appropriate concession structure that deals with risk and assignment of risks. Without these factors, foreign companies simply will not come into Moscow at all. Then we're dealing with the political and certainty risks. Can a company get its profits out? Can they repatriate profits? Can they repatriate their capital? And is there that stable tax regime? The current experience, though, in Canada is not that great. What we're seeing now is that companies are not making a lot of money on these agreements, on these concession agreements. The risks are very onerous. The terms are long enough. And when you're dealing with projects that are running well over the $5 and $10 billion, it's not easy to make a profit on these, given those extensive risks. Innovation is getting tighter because of various environmental regulations, fairness concerns, etc. And running these processes from the public side is very onerous. We're looking in Canada with some of our current bids of giving gratuities running into the $70 to $100 million just to get companies to bid and do the type of work, pre-work that needs to be done in these projects. So even in Canada, we need to attract companies and compete against other jurisdictions. As I said, risks are a lot more onerous, and then you overlay that with the various political risks depending on in what jurisdiction one is in. In terms of investment attraction, number one, deal flow. Number two, deal flow. Number three, deal flow. If someone is going to spend money to come into a jurisdiction, they may not win the first, they may not win the second, but there needs to be a deal flow that's having an opportunity to get into the next transaction. Certainty and predictability, and a stable tax regime and political stability. What we're finding, as I said, they're not supportable. We are exploring new models. We're exploring different types of models where we're looking at early contract engagement, integrated project delivery structures, not-profit distribution structures, and alliance contracting. We're also looking at the impact of emerging and disruptive technologies. You've got 6,000 buses that are coming into this jurisdiction, 6,000 electric buses. Well, charging of 200 electric buses consumes as much power as approximately 6,000 houses. If you have 6,000 houses, you're comparing that to 180,000 houses in this jurisdiction. Notwithstanding, Russia has a very strong and a legacy system of power generation, but that's an awful lot of power that's coming just into those 6,000 units, notwithstanding the other electrification opportunities that we're seeing in new technology. So very quickly.
Yes, I would ask to have. Okay, perfect.
We asked for three opportunities. Number one, supportive infrastructure and power grid, as I spoke about. Number two, the TOD combined with station development. Transit-oriented development simply will not pay for the cost of this infrastructure. We haven't seen it anywhere in the world. There are very few jurisdictions that where transit pays. One of them happens to be Tokyo, another one Hong Kong, but it's the transit-oriented development does not pay for it, but it does cover the vast majority of station development costs. So if you separate that from the full alignment of the transit, that's a very good opportunity. Route optimization with charger locations is a very strong opportunity. We are working with the city to do that. I think I'll stop there and let my colleagues take on from me.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Есть ли у кого-нибудь вопросы к мистеру?
Any questions to the speaker, to Mr. Seider? У меня
In your thesis, I can see that you supposed to speak some words about tax increment financing. Can you please describe how it works in Canada? Briefly.
It doesn't work very well.
That's why I'm asking.
It works a little bit in the United States,
Okay.
but it does not work well. So essentially, you're selling the futures is basically what we do with tax increment financing. So we have a very high tax regime, and by putting in the infrastructure, we expect that taxes will increase as well, and you're spending those futures on taxes. I think in Moscow, the mayor took parking revenue and he put it towards this infrastructure, but he did it the other way around. He committed to the infrastructure, and then he's using a parking revenue to pay it back, and I think it's probably a better way of doing it.
Okay. So, I have another question, and maybe it's also the question for the next speaker, Mr. Trusov. For now, we have the share of private investment in infrastructure very low. Generally in the world, it's less than 5% for all transportation investment, especially for infrastructure, not for rolling stocks, for infrastructure. Do you think that we have the potential to grow, to make a bigger share, to increase this share?
Absolutely. I think there's a tremendous opportunity here. But to be frank, we need to get through a number of issues. Clearly, there's the political challenges that we have, global political issues that international companies have a tough time investing in Russia. That's a given.
That's true.
And then repatriation of profits is another very important consideration. So you need to be able to repatriate your profits and your initial capital. So I think those are the two things that need to be dealt with. But there's absolutely an opportunity to participate and collaborate in P3s. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Я хотел бы предоставить слово.
I would like to give the floor to Evgeny Trusov, Deputy Head of the Financing Infrastructure Department in VTB.
Совсем не относится к известной поговорке «про денег нет, но вы держитесь».
Well, so you have a few minutes more to tell us more about your activity. Probably we'll have Q&A more. Do I have 15 minutes, or do you have 15 minutes for all, or just for my presentation? We have, yeah, okay, so we're limited by 6. All right. Okay, I will try to pick up my presentation so that the other speakers should also have some time left. Within this session, I'm the only bank representative. So, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of investments into infrastructures, especially private investments, our bank is one of the biggest investors in private ownership. So all these kinds of private-public ownership has been well experienced by our bank in the Russian environment. Exactly. Why do we pay so much attention to this kind of cooperation? Since 10 years ago, we've started implementing the public-private cooperation in Russia as well, through concession agreements and other long-term agreements. So they were focused at creation and further operating the transport systems. So transport concessions used to be the main type of agreements in our bank. But as you see, there are some other some other banks are also engaged into these concessions. There are some other banks, some foreign companies. Two of those foreign companies are our partners. There are some other partners who have procured our share in our share in Pulkovo Airport project. So we're not yet talking about the massive interest of into these projects and attracting of public investments into these kind of projects. It's really not easy to implement. It needs a thorough feasibility study. It needs a long-term orientation, long-term planning, competition-based process. The mutual understanding in between business and the government in regard to how those consortiums should be built of, what risks should be managed, what is the interest of both sides. So this is a pretty complex task. But what it lets us to finally do is to speed up the process of implementing a project. It is much faster than attracting the budget money for this or that project. So this is still possible, quite this is quite an operationable kind of cooperation in our country as well. Even in those countries where it seems that the government budget is big enough to finance all the entire projects. Probably the only region which can invest, which can finance the entire project is Moscow. There is not a single other comparable region that has this big budget, and this is why all the other regions' authorities keep attracting the private sector. But you should take into account that the private sector is interested in gaining the benefit. So this is the basics. So without the possibility to gain profit, you cannot attract the public sector. Otherwise, it will remain just a pure waste of time on the conferences and meaningless discussions. So public-private cooperation should be based on the agreements, as well as in any other business, especially if we talk about the long-term projects, if we talk about some networks, tens of kilometers long. In order to attract this kind of investments, you should provide a purely transparent understanding of the project framework so that you can plan your costs and your profits. You should also, so that the public sector should be able to make the long-term planning, probably with the help of some governmental institution with its own obligations in terms of this project. And probably it might also have some other governmental institution might probably help to attract credit for 20-30 years of this long-term project. Moscow is also engaged in such projects, but not quite the same ones. Like the metropolitan project is a type of financing that the producers actually attract. Our bank has become the major partner of this project. We were focused to attract big enough investment for the whole term of concession, basing on the fact that this project is guaranteed by the regional government. But of course, the train producers, or as well as the equipment producers, have no ability. They are not able to attract this amount of investment. So we still need to create some financial conditions in order to attract this kind of long-term financing. Another important aspect of this kind of cooperation is that you need to provide a transparent scheme of controlling and of operating the project. So who will be responsible for providing the land? Who will be responsible for this land operation? This is all very important. If we're talking about Kutuzovsky Prospect, there was only one investor who was able to become responsible for operating this highway. Same is in St. Petersburg. There is not such a traffic like in Moscow, and you can hardly provide this kind of. You can hardly make that much profit operating the highway in St. Petersburg, which is comparatively less than the Moscow. But in order to let my colleagues have more time for their own presentations, I will let me answer any other questions if you have any questions. Okay, I have one. If a cable lift project initiator applied to the bank, it's not easy yet to forecast the traffic. So how would you perceive this kind of project? How would you perceive this? How would you react to this initiative? Well, we would, of course, consider this kind of project and would consider the risks. Cable lift project for us is quite a new type of transport. And the way how you create the demand on this transport is not transparent yet for us. Of course, you can calculate the traffic, you can forecast the traffic, and basing on that study, you might forecast you might allocate the necessary financing, but I wouldn't do that with yet, because there are too few projects yet, and the risks seem to be too high. Yes, there are some successful cases in Russia, so we should probably take a thorough look at these projects, see who the investors are, and probably having this information, basing on this information, we might probably reduce the risk and say yes to this kind of project. But in the meantime, well, there are almost no cases of such cable lift projects. It's not easy to avoid those risks. Well, now let's. How about listening to Mr. Thomas Spiegelberg, Vice President of Barthollet Maschinenbau. You are now engaged in building the second cable lifts in Moscow. Please tell us more about it.
First of all, thank you very much that I have been part of this convention. Now you can see what we can do with a part of the money. I think money is enough on the world, and our company is manufacturing ropeways all over the world, all type.
Is it you?
And, pardon?
Is it you?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, on the left, yes. Okay, we are based in Switzerland, and we are doing a complete range. It means engineering, sales, manufacturing, transport, assembly, and even sometime operation of the system. We sales solution of ropeways, not a ropeway himself. It means 80%, 90% are more or less standards components, and all the rest is manufactured specially for that case. So later on, I speak short for some example for PPP. SURF is a special agreement from Switzerland, is a government-based insurance company and leasing for such type of installation. We must implement our system direct into the brown area. It must be a picture of all. This is very important, and the basic is normally for that project traffic studies. So the basic for all the things to attract investors is it starts by the quality of the product. It must be absolutely clear, well done. The guest must have pleasure, the best comfort. Here we have in Moscow our first installation we are proud of. We work together with Porsche Design Studio for the cars. And this is important that we attract the guest. Even here is a funicular in Istanbul, also a type of connection feeder design. We can do VIP cabin special agreements, and now this installation is in France, Brest. It's complete custom-made for that case, to cross over the harbor. Now, what are the advantages for a ropeway for an investor? It's part of a whole system that we know here in Moscow. We can be part of it. If you look at what we can do, everything is positive for a ropeway. We hotspot, we have airport connection, we have from ship, from harbor, from bus station, everything is working, and we can reduce per day 70 to 100,000 cars on the line. And this is important. If you can see what happens, then we are really flexible for all kind of transport. We are quick in the installation, low money for, and if you look at the investment, if you compare with buses or other transports, we are not the cheapest one, but on long time, 20, 30 years in maintenance, operation costs, we are absolutely a runner. So, here we have an example in Russia, in Moscow, as PPP project. So we invested, the private investment was 30%, due a time of 5 to 7 years payback due to the operation. It's one of the examples. I go forward to Narvik, another example which was realized last year as well, like here in Moscow. It's a Swiss-supported project by the insurance. The client had to pay 15% cash and 85% is on a payback realization of 5 to 7 years. The interest rate is 3.6%. It's very interesting, but it is also depending on the financial situation of the client and the country. It's very flexible. That's what we can do. And the other advantage for us is that we are from the beginning 100% paid for. So we have no risk for the installation, for the delivery and commissioning. Last but not least, leasing, you know everything about leasing. We have done it in Poland. One case, it was we have to pay the guarantee for the leasing company, and in that case, after 3 years, the client was not able to pay back, and so we took back, disassembled it, and placed it on another situation, and we get them back for 40% of the investment. Now I show you short what we can do.
Это не колыбельная, можете все посмотреть.
It's not a lullaby.
So this, what we can do into the cities, that it's the traffic components, and I hope we can be part also in the future with our systems.
Спасибо большое. Thank you very much. У кого-нибудь есть вопросы про канатные дороги?
Any questions on ropeways? Surely these projects are interesting. My question is probably to Artyom, whether ropeways will be in demand in Moscow. Will it not be the same story as with the monorail road? And whether Muscovites will look at it as an entertainment or a full-fledged component of the transit system. We expect that these ropeways will be in demand. We rely on international experience, and then on top of that, in Russia, there are examples of successful implementation of ropeway systems in the cities. Probably you don't know that the ropeway between Nizhny Novgorod and Bor town. It's a very successful project, which was implemented, and the traffic intensity is growing year on year. There are some concerns that there are other types of transport in the city. People may be cautious to use ropeways, but the practice is that these ropeways are very safe, comfortable, and have a clear advantage over other transportation modes. Any more questions? Good afternoon, I'm from Belarus. We have a project which is treated very skeptically by the professional communities, called Skyway. It's a string technology system. And could you say, is there any, let's say, similarity to your ideas of ropeways? Простите, что вы... The difference between a ropeway project and the idea of string transport.
About this Skyway projects, maybe it's better to explain because nobody knows about it.
Skyway, I don't know what we are speaking on as project.
Томас не знает, что такое струнный транспорт.
It's an answer to my question that it's a technology, which is not mature, and probably it's poor. We ran out of time, but I will ask Maxim Tkachenko to make a final presentation, to do a wrap-up of today's meetings. He is a person who is responsible for private-public partnership in this country. There is the Ministry of Economy on that, and the Ministry of Finance, and other agencies. Pavel has identified three main issues, three key issues. And by your leave, we'll start with slide number 1. The first question, which was, no, the last question which was asked by Paul, what do we need to attract investment in this, let's say, sector, in the municipal transport sector? In Russia, there are 124 projects underway. These are largely motorway infrastructure, transit nodes. There is a railway terminal, which is reconstructed at concession, parking areas, etc. In recent several years, the share of municipal projects is rapidly increasing. About half of the projects can be treated as projects intended to develop major cities, because the soluble demand and traffic are concentrated in these transportation centers, and an investor has a clear view of how investment will pay back. But the recent projects of streetcars in Izhevsk, Novosibirsk, Yekaterinburg demonstrates that, well, emergence of an investor changes the view of the public entity on the transport model, about routing, network, etc. There is a risk The public side may draw very nice pictures, but will there be sufficient utilization rate? And the public side has to propose a comprehensive approach to development of the transit network in the city. Only that will attract a private investor. Second question, what sectors are undervalued now? The most vivid examples is the western speed diameter, streetcars in Krasnogorsk and St. Pete, 17 projects of transit nodes in Moscow, and a small size example, multi-level parking lot in Sakhalin. Well, a small number of investment of 446 million rubles. This is a local story. And some sectors are missing on this list, like intercity transportation, digitalization of the ticketing system, electric buses. Moscow is a trailblazer here, and one of the first PPP contracts was made in Izhevsk at the electric vehicle charging terminal. Well, a very brief contract, maybe 20 pages, but it is an example of how even small towns are trying to enter in this area. Well, without co-financing from the federal budget, small cities will not be handled that. For ropeways, well, Moscow set a very good example. Many cities would like to do the same, but it's 50%. It's the, well, obvious story. That's an attempt to make a tourist infrastructure, not a transport. And 50% is a pinpoint approach to your transportation problems. And the final slide, a few words about why we need a private investor. If we look at the PPP projects in the municipal transport, some interesting figures were given. 30 years for PPP contracts. That's the average term for our motor road transports. For municipal transport, the usual contract runs for 20 years. And the split between private and public investment is 2-to-1. The average size of investment in this project is 1.8 billion rubles, which is something like $20+ million. And this amount may be spent in other countries only for preparation of a tender. Well, this is the specifics of Russian public-private partnership sector. This is local businesses largely excepting for a few number of mega projects. The contract is normally concession. There is a corporate PPP form normally. And finally, I want to say that most of the payback models is based on consumers or other commercial activity. How investors now and viewed, they look, local authorities look at a private investor as a person to whom they will put over a loss-making business. Somewhere there is a fleet of streetcars that which are making only losses, and the private investor will arrive, well, who through advertising on more efficient approaches will relieve release us of this burden. Maybe we'll pay something from the budget, but better to avoid that. This is how it is viewed now. And in answer to a question why we need a private investor, primarily we need private investor who has better better management skills than the public side, and better risk management as well. A final slide probably. This is a trend that we're witnessing now, digitalization of the transport infrastructure. There are very few projects that can be classified under this category in Russia. Even fewer in the municipal transport. We find only 7 of them. The rest is this video recording. This is a story which is rapidly developing in this country. And in a couple of years, we see a variety of interesting concessions with the digitalization in the public transport sector. Thank you. Thank you, Maxim. I thank everybody. I think that today's discussion was pretty interesting. I hope we'll see each other again.